Who am I? I was coming to that. I was coming to that. My name's Luke Ashworth, and I'm the chair of the World War 100 Steering Committee. I also do international relations. So this is my presentation is kind of setting the scene and a sort of an international relations presentation in terms of giving you a sense of what was going on around the world, around the time of the morning of the 1st of July, 1916. But what I want to start with, perhaps, this is again, just to warm you up. I'm just imagining you're just a normal class of students. They always need to be warmed up. So I'm going to warm you up here by asking you a few questions. About machine guns, cavalry, and walking really, really slowly. This would be great for those who saw the film last night. There was a line in the film where they said that these dastardly generals forced their men to walk very, very slowly towards the Germans. Why? Why? Now, I don't want us just to get the same answers from the keen ones in the front. I want to hear some people in the back taking part. Why? Anyone got an idea? Control. Control. Good one. Yes, yes. That's the way it's always been done. Very good. Anyone else? Their packs were heavy. Great. Now, you'll all be pleased to know that every single one of those things you said is wrong. And actually, it's not mentioned in the film. It's presented as Haig being a very nasty person, which, you know, perhaps he was, perhaps he wasn't. I never met him. But actually, there's a good reason why you walked really, really slowly, because you didn't want to get killed. You didn't crawl because it was too far. There's anywhere between 50 and 250 yards between trenches on both sides in the First World War. So crawling's out. Running is out, A, because you'd get tired, but B, more importantly, you get killed by your own side. It didn't feature in the film yesterday, but they weren't idiots. They had a rolling barrage of artillery to protect their troops. You walked slowly behind the barrage. So there's a myth. There's a good reason why you walk slowly. It's to protect you, to keep you alive. Another thing, machine guns. No, Haig loved machine guns. He didn't hate them. And early as 1898, he was advocating machine guns. And finally, cavalry. No, there were not 2 corps of cavalry stuck behind the British lines doing nothing the whole war. Haig broke up the cavalry in 1916 in March. The cavalry were disbanded. Another myth. And there's lots of myths about the First World War. You know, it's a war that somehow accumulates myths. And I think a lot of the presentations today will be talking about, you know, unlearning and relearning new and interesting things about the First World War. It's even more interesting than the myths we have. And I want to start here taking you, first of all, on the soldier's eye view that we saw with the film, which the film does very well. Film does this very well. And the film last night did this very well as well. Being there, waiting in the early morning for this big battle that you've been training for 2 years. The question many of them may have asked is, why are we here? And why this spot on a rather boring, flat French river plain at this time of year? What's going on everywhere else? Let's put the Somme into context. So let's pull out from and try to answer these soldiers' questions. I think the first place to start is to go to the Western Front. I think David Mercer's presentation later on is going to do a lot better job of doing the maps on this one. The Belgian, British, French sector. At the time, the French were under extreme pressure in Verdun and were crying out for the British to finally do something. Because, to tell you the truth, up until about 1st of July 1916, British war effort on the Western Front was, compared to the French, was pretty poor. The French had been left to really hold the bag, despite the myths of Mons and Le Cateau, with the exception probably of the First Battle of Ypres. The British, by comparison to the French, hadn't been doing that much. So there was push from the French to do something more. But why here? Why here on the Western Front? Why this line? And I think for that, before we start thinking about space, we have to think about time. How did we get where we were? What happens in 1914 affects what happens in 1916. In 1914, the Germans lose the war. That's a over-dramatic way of saying it, because of course they're still in the war. And they do kind of, through the submarine war, do find a possible way out and winning strategy. But largely in 1914 they lose the war. The Germans there's the famous Schlieffen Plan, and largely their plan to knock France out early and then to come back on Russia fails. Also, what also fails is the Austro-Hungarians fail their allies. Everyone overestimates the Austro-Hungarians. Austria-Hungary had many things going for it. Waltzes, beautiful uniforms, great coffee houses. Vienna was a wonderful intellectual center. But one thing they weren't that good at was war. Well, not until much later. The situation in 1914 is the miracle of the Marne. The French stop, and it's largely the French. The BEF doesn't actually contribute very much, except at Ypres. But it's the French that stop the Germans on the Marne River, losing many more men every day than actually the British Empire forces lost at the Somme. One battle, for example, in these battles in August of 1914, the French lose 27,000 men in one encounter alone. That's much higher than the 20,000 at the first day of the Battle of the Somme. The bloodiest year for the French army is 1914, and it puts the Somme in the shade. It's not to say the Somme is awful, but it's to say that so was 1914. The Germans are effectively stopped, and this trench line emerges. But they also fail in the east. Yes, they win Tannenberg, preventing the Russians from invading Germany. But at the same time, the Russians actually, despite this setback at Tannenberg, they defeat the Austrians, and the Germans find themselves having to prop up their Austrian allies. By the end of 1914, the Central Powers have pulled back to defensive positions, and the Allies are planning a way of breaking the stalemate, breaking the defensive Central Powers lines to defeat the Central Powers. The Central Powers are on the back foot. The Allies are winning. The question is only when. And they're hoping in 1916 that 1916 will be the big year, the year that they end the war. Which brings us to 1916. This is Europe in the Near East in June 1916. There are several fronts, and I'm going to run you round them. There's the Western Front, which I shall return to in a bit, and there we have the Somme there. The French, of course, are fighting in Verdun. There's the naval war, which we often forget, despite the fact that so many Newfoundlanders were involved in that. There's the Eastern Front, which having its own offensive. There's the Near East. There's the Balkans. There's the Italian Front. These are all going on and have their own events going on at the same time. The Somme is not actually the big highlight of 1916. It is one of them. It's on the front page, but it's not necessarily, depending on where you live, of course, the headline. There's the war at sea and elsewhere. The big event here is the Battle of Jutland in early June, May, June. And there'll be more on that on the war at sea later on, when the Germans make their last attempt to actually take on the British surface fleet. And they never come out again. But there's also, by 1916, with the exception of guerrilla war in Tanganyika, the German colonies have all been mopped up. And the war at sea is increasingly about submarines and blockades. We move on. We're going clockwise here. The war at sea over to the Eastern Front. There's also a massive offensive on the Eastern Front, almost unknown amongst people in the English-speaking world, the BRUSILOV offensive, which is a dramatic offensive. Romania declares war on the Central Powers, and then with a massive Russian force moves in. They don't get their objectives, but large amount of the units of the Austro-Hungarian army disintegrate. And again, the Germans find themselves having to prop up the Austro-Hungarians. And this goes on for months. The BRUSILOV offensive goes on for months. It starts before, it ends after the Somme. Also the Middle East. The Russians have broken through Ottoman lines in the Caucasus. The British and French haven't had a good time of it, actually, though. The siege of Kut al-Amara saw a British army surrender to the Ottomans. But they're beginning to make inroads. But perhaps two very important events in 1916. One was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which largely gave the Russians what they wanted in the Ottoman Empire. It's much more about the Russians than the French and the British in some respects. And of course is often brought up in terms of, it's a myth, but it's brought up in terms of the boundaries of Syria and Iraq, which actually has very little to do with, but that's another story. And the other one, of course, is the beginning of the Armenian Genocide. 1916 is the year of the Armenian Genocide. Well, it starts in 1915, you're right, but so what I meant was the events, yes, exactly. Yes, it starts, and of course it goes on throughout the war, but 1916, the Armenian Genocide is ongoing. The Balkans, the Serbs have been finally defeated. They are crawling across the mountains into Albania in 1915. In 1916, units of the Serbian army are being evacuated, and the Allies are re-establishing a new base in the Balkans around Salonika, Thessaloniki in northern Greece. Interesting enough, again, if you want to put sort of, this is a horrendously violent war. And if I want to put things again into perspective, it's usually considered about 25% of the population, adult male population of Serbia, die in the war. And we have no figures for the civilians who were killed in atrocities during the war in Serbia. But that's another unnamed number to add to that. Serbia probably per capita suffered the most of any country during the war. And then there's the Italian front. Seemed like a good idea at the time. The Italians declare war on the Central Powers, being offered under the London Treaty large parts of the Adriatic and a few other things as well. And it all seems to be going quite well in 1916. There are minor Italian offensives in 1915. Yet on the Italian front, it still seems as though this is going to draw off a lot of Central Power forces. The Italians are, in 1917, will suffer a humiliating defeat at Caporetto, which not only will force Britain and France to help prop up the Italians, but will actually lead indirectly to fascism. Many of the Italian troops felt betrayed by their generals, by their leaders, and also by fifth columns behind the border. And many of the groups of ex-servicemen would, of course, form the backbone of the ranks of the fascists. Which brings us back all the way round, as we go sort of clockwise, round to the Somme. And again, we join our soldiers on the front line in that morning. And that is where I leave you, and this is where we open up with the other presentations and the panel. I hope you will enjoy today, and that it'll be an opportunity for not just us to present, but also to discuss with you. Because I'm sure that many of you also have knowledge and ideas that you'd like to share with us.